Hey, everybody. Welcome to a Kiteworks conversation with Michael Daniel. This is going to be a great discussion. If you've taken a look at his background before viewing today's podcast, you'll see that he has like 21, 22, 23 years of experience in the cybersecurity space, primarily on the government sector. So, it's a plethora of experience and background that he brings to this discussion through the government lens. But now he's, for the last 4 or 5 years, has been the president and CEO of the Cyber Threat Alliance. So, Michael, thanks for joining us today. It's going to be a pleasure speaking with you.
Oh, thank you for having me. I really appreciate the opportunity.
My co-host, Tim Freystone, is also on the phone. Tim, glad to have you as always.
Yeah, thanks, Patrick. Good to see you. Nice to meet you, Michael.
Good to meet you as well.
So, Michael, can you talk a bit about the Cyber Threat Alliance? We might talk a bit about your background in the OMB and so forth at the same time, and then the almost 5 years you spent as a Cybersecurity Coordinator for the federal government. But Cyber Threat Alliance is doing some really cool things. I've been watching you for the past 4 or 5 years. What is it for those who are listening to the podcast who don't know who you are? And then we'll talk a bit about some of the cool things you're doing.
Yeah, so CTA is a threat intelligence sharing organization. And what really makes us a little bit different is who we're focused on. We are a membership association, so companies, join the alliance. But our target audience is really cybersecurity providers. So cybersecurity companies, the security arms of telcos, platform providers, anybody who's providing cybersecurity services more broadly than to just themselves. That's our target audience, to encourage and enable threat intelligence sharing to occur between those organizations. We currently have 36 different members from about 11, headquartered in 11 different countries around the world that actively participate in the alliance. And of course, we're always looking for more and, trying to expand and grow the alliance. But that's really what we do. And
different organizations can subscribe to the data that you're aggregating. You talk a bit about that process, or what does that look like?
Sure. So we really talk about our sharing happening in two different modes. One is our automated mode. And so this is where our members will share technical indicators of compromise and the associated context that goes with that. So, hashes, binaries, URLs, domain names, ports, mutexes, registry keys, any of the stuff that, are the technical indicators that something bad has been happening to you. And along with the, context that helps situate those indicators in time and space, if you will, sort of date, time stamps, process flow, MITRE attack patterns, those kinds of things. And all of this is shared through a proprietary platform that we built. And so when you share into CTA, you then get access to what everybody else has shared. And so you can then take that data and use that in your products and services. You can use that for your research. You can use that to test, things. I found this. Did somebody else in CTA see that? So there's a variety of use cases for that. In addition to that automated sharing that we do, and to give you some sense of the scale, we're operating somewhere between 325,000 and 375,000 indicators a day that go through the platform. Sometimes it's as high as 400,000. So it's a pretty solid volume. In addition to that automated sharing, though, we also try to build trust among our members and develop a human sharing community as well. Because what we've learned over the past 5.5 years of running CTA is that you need that automated side for certain use cases, but you also need the human-to-human interaction for other use cases. And so we also have tried to build a way for the researchers and analysts among our members to work together, to collaborate, to come to know each other and trust each other so that they can share at that human speed as well. So those are really the two pillars the two sharing pillars that CTA rests on.
What's an example of a human-to-human use case that you just cited?
Sure. So, for example, one of them is that we have what we call our early sharing program. So many of our members will share pre-publication versions of white papers or blogs before they go live. And so, and they might share the associated indicators that go with that. So, the value of that to the community is that a broader array of the community gets a heads up about something that's coming out that's identifying malicious activity. They have a chance to position their products and services, their company, to be ready for that. So it has an even bigger impact when it comes out because there's more companies already implementing the protections against the threats that are identified in that report, for example. Oh, and our members love it too, because then, when the CEO calls down to the research lab or whatever, it's like, hey, have you seen that thing from the blah? Yeah, boss, we're already on top of it. Got it. You're covered. We're covered. Good. That's a much better answer than we're madly scrambling to look for everybody likes that. So it generally works much better that way. So that's just one example on the human side of what we do. And like I said, it's very popular among our members.
One thing I've always wanted to ask, now that I have the opportunity to ask you, is I've been fascinated by the fact that this alliance brings together so many business competitors. Let's call
Sure.
it. What's the secret sauce there? And does conflict arise? Is there any level of data hoarding, or is it pretty altruistic and everybody's in the game for the greater good, so to speak?
So I would argue that it's somewhere in between. I mean, yes, there's always that level of altruism, but one of the things that our members have learned and that we very much promote is that sharing like this actually makes you more competitive. Because really, the value that you bring as a security company is not the raw indicators, right? The value you bring as a security company is what you're doing with those indicators. What are you doing with that data? How are you helping your customers? How are you analyzing it? How are you processing it? How are you transforming that data into information and knowledge? So a lot of it is that we're very much focused on that data layer, and that by focusing on that, we actually avoid a lot of the competitive conflicts. The other piece is that we very much, just to comply with U.S. antitrust law, but also as a matter of practice, we don't talk about products, services, prices, any of that stuff where the competition is occurring. Mm-hmm. We're focused on the bad guy, and we're focused on enabling our members to work together against the adversary. And so that really helps create a space where the collaboration can occur, mm-hmm. and can still enable the competition to occur. But actually, my argument is we're helping the competition occur at a higher level of the value chain, because instead of trying to compete on, I know something the other guy doesn't know, which if you actually think about it, since no one has complete view of the whole ecosystem, is actually my inadequate pool of data is bigger than his inadequate pool of data.
Yes, right.
It's not a great argument. So instead, we're pushing that competition up to a different part of the value chain. And that's a much better place for the ecosystem as a whole for that competition to be occurring.
Yeah, sure. Makes sense.
Is it easier to capture attack data versus actual data around reported intrusions? Are they more reluctant to report the latter?
Well, sure. I mean, we're very careful to actually say, whenever we talk to potential member companies, you don't want to share specific customer information with me, and I don't want it, right? I don't want to have to protect it. I don't want to have to deal with it. I don't need it. And you don't want to send it to me. So it's in everybody's interest to not have that happen. Yes, we do try to actually collect a lot, and we encourage our members to actually share as much about the MITRE attack categories, for example, as they can, because that's actually very useful data for our members for the other members to have. So it's really kind of interesting how that started to evolve, and what we've discovered is that no matter how hard MITRE has worked at defining these categories, and no matter how hard we worked at pre-populating categories, we still have these edge cases and things where we're trying to figure out how to fit things into the categories and stuff like that. So it's not easy to do. And it's not easy to do at speed, at scale, but that's something that we're constantly learning and trying to get better at.
Makes a lot of sense.
So obviously there's the threat vectors, the threat actors, the threats themselves. Sometimes that's all wrapped up into just people just going about their daily job, the human attack vector, I guess. Do you collect information on just people being people and kind of what's happening with, social engineering on a broader scale, or is it primarily focused on digital threats?
Yeah, so it's really more about the digital threats. We really focus on that technical data layer.
Sure.
And it's not that the things that you're talking about there aren't important. It's just that's not our specialty. Now I do think that, where you would see that inside CTA is, again, more on our analytics side. You could definitely see like a group of our analysts getting together and, we maintain the equivalent of a Slack channel, right, for our members. And you could easily, frequently we see discussions about like, hey, we've seen this phishing campaign.
Yeah.
Anybody else seen this thing? Those kinds of questions and sharing definitely occur.
Yeah, I got it. I'm always pressing that question because it's just one of the hardest ones to answer, right? How do you solve the people being people problem, and what kind of data is out there around that?
Sure. And I mean, my standing joke is that like once you get your organization to a certain size, you are just going to have somebody in your organization who is going to click the link. I almost refer to it as like the monkey reflex. What is that? It's sort of like, it seems to be sort of baked into primates or something that we just have to, go explore or whatever. And so the truth is that like you can't engineer that away entirely. And so you have to just be prepared. And that's why we talk about that defense in depth and other things, because you just have to be prepared that that's going to happen some of the time. I mean, and, the bad guys, I think, are constantly trying to get more sophisticated at that. But, in many ways, that's old school stuff, right? I mean, that kind of social engineering has been around for a couple of thousand years of trying to swindle other people and that sort of thing. So
just a new vector for it emerges. Is all. Yeah.
So when you were the cybersecurity coordinator for 5 years, you saw a lot, learned a lot. What are some of the elements you took from that experience, like 2 or 3 or 4, that you took over into CTA that are making you more effective as an organization?
Well, I think there's a couple of things that I really took from that experience. I would say one is, information sharing is hard. We talk about it a lot and we act as if it should be easy. But my standing joke is that, like, information sharing is the anti-field of dreams. Just because you build a platform doesn't mean they will share, right? That it really takes a lot of investment and commitment to make it happen. I think one of the other key lessons that I very much brought based on my experience both in the government and now, validated by my time with CTA is really, we need to also think much more about where comparative advantage lies. I mean, this is a long-standing economic concept, right? But, when you look at the comparative advantage of the government and the private sector cybersecurity firms, right? The government's comparative advantage is not in finding technical IOCs. In fact, in the 5-something years that I've been here at CTA, we have yet to get a technical indicator from the government that somebody somewhere in my in the alliance didn't already have. But what the government does bring to the table is context. That indicator is important versus that one. Why? Because that indicator is associated with this actor. This actor is particularly active against your sector. Right? The government's comparative advantage is they can bring in intelligence capabilities, law enforcement capabilities that the private sector just doesn't have, and can do those cross correlations to give you the context of why this versus that. And I think really focusing the government on its comparative advantage and focusing the private sector on its comparative advantage, I think is not something that we've done enough of. And it's definitely something that we need to push harder on to make the ecosystem more, much more effective. I would say the other thing, of course, and, one of any of the people who worked with me during that time know that one of my favorite sayings was, never attribute exclusively to evil when stupid is still available as an option, which that remains true today, because sometimes things are just an accident, and you shouldn't always leap to the nefarious conclusion until you've actually ruled out the accident option. So,
yeah, the to that point, Verizon, their data breach report that they put out, I don't know, a few weeks ago, it does. What's that?
A few months ago.
Time flies. It lists obviously all vectors and threat actors that they record, but you saw, interestingly enough, the accident and lost assets sort of trend down a bit as a aggregate, but system intrusion go up, and there are a lot of drivers to system intrusion, but one of the biggest ones was partners. If not I think it was number one, was the partners in your partner ecosystem. And that, I mean, at the core of that is information sharing, right?
Right.
It's your information moving through your business process ecosystem and their information moving through yours. Yeah, it's just interesting how this changes and how challenging it is to predict what next year is going to look like and where to put the effort. And obviously intelligence like that comes through the Cyber Threat Alliance is one step closer to predicting that, I suppose.
Yeah, and I mean, I think part of it is also like, if there ever was a network perimeter, right,
Yeah.
which is arguable. If there ever was a network perimeter, it's certainly gone now, right?
Yeah.
Between work from anywhere to these partner relationships to the way that you have to be embedded in the digital ecosystem, like the idea that you're going to be able to sort of have this neatly contained network that you can enumerate every single device on it at every second, and it's going to be static, right? It's a falsehood, right? It just doesn't work that way. And so you've got devices that are, your network is constantly changing. It's your assets are constantly, some assets are coming on, they're coming off.
Mm-hmm.
The topography is changing as people move around and their connections come in. So, it's a much more dynamic world. And I think your point about the partnerships, right? Now you've got different people coming in and they've got different levels of permission about how they hook into you. And, it just makes it much more complex, but we're not going to unwind that, right? We're not going to decomplexify that in terms of those relationships. Now you can try to remove some of the complexity from your security, and there are things you can do there. But I think trying to go back to this idea that, we'll have this nice, neat perimeter with this highly enumerated static network inside is just, that's just not reality.
Yeah, the modifier of network perimeter is certainly gone, and then the last 5 years, the perimeter, which is people and devices and IoT, right? It's kind of less network and more endpoint, but even that is not trying to tackle that problem at an infrastructure level is just beating your head against the wall. But the piece that seems to always get missed is nobody's actually trying to secure the network or the devices for the security of those network and devices' sake. It's for the data that moves around it. So, I've been on the soapbox for, I don't know, a little while of that we did it all backwards. Like, why didn't we should have started with the data and where the data goes and where, at the data level. Because then it doesn't matter the infrastructure. So if you're, applying risk frameworks and you're applying zero trust and all down to the data, well, your perimeter there then becomes wherever your data goes. And if you're controlling and tracking and protecting the data, irregardless, not a word, of where it goes, then you actually might have a fighting chance.
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And I think that you are, it becomes a much more complex problem. But if you focus again on, what do you actually care about? That's the other piece of this, right? That, I talk about comparative advantage, but that's another principle in there is what do you actually care about? Because there's some things that you don't care as much about, And, one of the other, again, Patrick, we go back to, one of those questions that you asked, sometimes people would talk about an intrusion and they had data leakage. And we say, well, what leaked? Well, name, phone number, address. Okay, so the stuff that used to be in what we call the phone book. All right, got it. Yeah, sure, it was a data leak, but do we care? I mean, right. Not really. And so again, it comes back to what is that information? Why do you care about it? What's the data that I actually care about?
Mm-hmm.
Classifying data is a big deal, I assume, in that case, from your perspective.
Yeah, no, that's right. And you really have to think about what your critical assets are, what your, how would you prioritize? What do you actually care about? Even in like CTA's case, right? Obviously we care about the platform first, right? Because that's our, that's our crown jewels, right? I mean, we care about our financial data because we're a business,
mm-hmm.
right? Do I care about our website? Yes. Because it's important for communicating, but so I wouldn't want it to get defaced, but that's lower down on my priority list, right? Compared to the platform and our financial data. We've got a pretty good idea, within CTA of how our data assets sort of, stack out. Do I have this down to every single file that we have? No, but we've got, good categorization of how we think about our data. Now, for us, it's relatively simple. We're a small organization, but I think most organizations have to think that through. The other lesson that I took out of my time in government too was you cannot assume that communication is happening. We had this really interesting experiment towards the end of my time in government where we actually went out and we asked all of the chief information security officers or CIOs offices of the major cabinet agencies and things. And we said, tell us your top 10 critical systems. And we got the lists back. And I remember we were sitting in the deputy chief of staff's office going through the lists with, senior people in the White House and looking at some of the agency responses, and we were like, this is crazy. There are things on here that nobody's ever heard of, and there are systems that we know about that are missing. What is the deal? And so then the deputy chief of staff, she was like, okay, well, let's go ask the secretaries, and the agency heads. So we went out, we asked the same set of questions to the secretaries and the agency heads, and we got back those lists. There was not complete divergence, but there was a wide divergence between the two lists for these agencies. And so then we started saying, okay, well, clearly there's not enough communication going on between the senior policy level and the technical level. Now, it did not always mean that one was right and one's wrong, because sometimes you had secretaries saying look, okay, I know that this system is not as critical to the functioning of the agency, but it's the system that if something happens to it, I'm going to be on the front page of the Washington Post.
Right. It's the definition of critical in that sense.
Right.
Critical to what
data is contained or can be accessed through that system.
Yeah. And then in other cases, it was the technical people were like, yes, I know the secretary put that on the list, but we're retiring that system in 3 months. It's not critical from that sense because we're already shifting to something else. Right. And so so I'm not going to put any more money on that system that we're retiring. And so the fundamental lesson that I took from that was you can't assume that even inside these organizations that level of communication is happening. And the business version of that is the C-suite actually talking to, the technical people, the business lines, are the security people actually talking to the business people about what systems they actually care about, what actually matters. And, is that actually, in fact, lined up so that you got the priorities in the same spot? Sure, it's easy to see how that happens in giant, cabinet agencies, but it happens in even, medium-sized enterprises too.
Sure.
And it changes over time. So you can't have that we had that conversation back in 2017. Okay, great. But, things are different now post-pandemic. And so maybe some things have changed since 2017. If you had that conversation recently, that sort of thing.
Yeah, it's almost like internal security ops, or not the operations of the security program or the infrastructure, but the operations of the security personnel and how information is shared up and down and left and right. And, definitions come into play significantly, to your point about one person thought critical meant this, another. So the complexities are at every level, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. And you always have to be thinking about that. And that's not a technical problem.
Right.
You can't solve that with like a shiny widget or something. You've got to actually have that. That's an organizational problem. And it's a management problem. So
when it comes to information sharing in incidents, organizations are typically reluctant to talk about those, but there's some new federal mandates that are being passed that you can no longer get away by failing to disclose an incident. What impact do you think that's going to have? And does CTA play a role in that at all?
Well, I think the impact's going to be huge. Cyber Incident Reporting for Critical Infrastructure Act, which I think we're all still trying to figure out, is that CERCIA? I don't think anybody knows how to pronounce the acronym.
We don't have a good acronym yet.
Yeah. That piece of legislation basically says if you own or operate an IT system in a critical infrastructure sector, and you basically meet some criteria that DHS is going to have to define, you are mandated, you are required to report a significant cyber incident to CISA. DHS is going through the process of actually writing the regulation to implement that law. And so it'll still be a while before that comes fully into force, but it's coming. And I think that's going to make a lot of difference to the government, because it's going to enable the U.S. government to get a much better sense of the scope and scale of the problem from a baseline that we actually know what it is. And you'll be able to start identifying trends. You'll be able to start identifying, campaigns in a different way. It'll provide the government with just much more fidelity on what's happening in the ecosystem more broadly. And I think it will really help us enable much better policy, and it will enable the federal government to also think about how to focus its disruption capabilities. Where should it actually put its time and money to have the greatest impact on the adversary and the best return for our national security, our national economic security, and our public health and safety. And so, I think that it's going to be a big advance. Now, one of the things that we need to be mindful of is, and this is the role that CTA is sort of playing in this area, is trying to help think through how you actually set up the process so that it's actually workable, right?
Process in terms of reporting to the.
How do you actually build the reporting process? What does that look like? If you are a user, or you're a business owner of a critical infrastructure asset, and you are the CEO and CISO of the 11 hospital and 24 doctor's office chain in Oklahoma City, right, and the surrounding region, and you've had a significant cyber incident. What does it look like for you to actually go and report? What does that look like, and how do we do that in a way that, because you're going through a significant cyber incident, you're having a really bad day, probably really bad month, right? Things are really crappy, and now you got to go file this report with the government. So it can't be the equivalent of the IRS 1040.
Right.
It cannot look like that, right? That's not going to be workable. It can't be something that is only fileable by the four guys at Mandiant that actually understand the thing, right? That's not going to be workable. It's going to have to be much more, the base form is going to have to be much, much simpler, much easier, much more user friendly, probably online, so that you can fill out in 15 minutes, and then, when you've had a month to actually analyze the incident, you can do the follow-up report where you actually get whatever firm you actually, engage to help you through it. Then they can go in and provide all the, technical details later on in the adjunct form. But these are the kinds of considerations that we want to get out there, and we want to try to help, DHS think through this, because I think it's really important to get this right. I also think it's important for the government to set some expectations, right? When you file a police report because your car got broken into, you don't necessarily expect the police to actually show up, right? Because you just don't. You don't expect them to send 8 squad cars to your neighborhood. That's just not how it works. And so you file the report because your insurance requires you to, because you also want to be a good citizen and make sure that the crime statistics are updated, or, other things like that. But you don't necessarily expect a huge law enforcement response. And I think the government also needs to set that expectation for critical infrastructure of hey, just because you reported does not necessarily mean an FBI flyaway team is going to show up at your doorstep.
Yeah.
Right.
That would certainly be a deterrent to facilitating participating in the submission, right?
Yeah, that's right.
And are they still working on the definition of significant as well? Is this kind of all a work in progress at this point?
So, it's interesting because the federal they're still working on the definition. And the reason why is because the federal government has a definition of what's significant for the federal government.
Uh-huh.
But that's not necessarily what is significant or material for an individual company. And the statute is written such that it's actually from the company's point of view that it is significant. And that is not always going to line up with how the federal government has defined significant in the past. So One of the things that we have done is we've been talking about how you kind of define that. And for CTA's purposes, we sort of define significant as, for one, something bad has happened to you, meaning you've had some sort of, your security has failed in some way. So an attempted intrusion, an attempted ransomware attack that failed, that's not an incident, right? Your snort flabulator caught it at the firewall and killed it. Yeah, that's not an incident, right? An incident is something happened that you didn't want to have happen, and it caused some sort of material impact to you as a business, right? You lost trade secrets that you care about. You lost money. You had a business interruption. And that's going to be a little bit subjective. It's always going to be a little bit subjective, but I think we can sort of narrow it, down to be a little more, have a little more rigor to it. And I think that's going to be the kind of definition that CIS is going to have to use in order to actually get we want enough reporting that you can set the baseline, but not so much that they're flooded. So
yeah, sure. And I think, to your earlier point that you made about the sort of commercial sector having data, and the federal government or the government sector having data, and trying to bring that information together for the purpose of cybersecurity. This seems like a forcing factor for that, right? Getting commercial entities to submit information to CISA and the DHS, and then now we've got the start of an aggregate, right?
Yeah, no, I think that's right. And you can start to actually put together the baseline, and you can start to figure out then you can start to have some statistical validity to the conclusions, right? Of what's happening, because you'll know what the baseline is. Mm-hmm. And you'll be able to start measuring. And you can also start seeing whether or not you'll be able to start seeing, whether or not certain things really make the difference that we've always said. And I think that's, there's just a lot of different things that you can do with this once you actually start to get that kind of data in with regularity and with consistent definitions.
Yeah.
Makes a lot of sense. Before we run out of time, I wanted to make sure we touch on the Ukraine war, because CTA and you in particular have been quite involved with some of the reporting around that, and aggregating data and watching, attacks. They ramped up, incidents ramp up at the same time. Give us an overview of what you guys have done in regards to the Ukraine war, and you continue to watch it. It's not simply, the first month and you're done. You've continued to work on it.
Well, I think we're involved with a consortium of companies that are trying to work together to help provide defensive capabilities to the Ukrainian government. Many CTA members are also involved in those efforts. And I think what you can see is, so what's been very fascinating to me is cyber has very much played a part. Cyber operations, cyber attacks have very much played a part in the Ukraine conflict. But what's been fascinating to me is some very key things that I think you can draw from this. One is that they have not had the level of strategic impact that I think a lot of people thought they were going to have. Now, I think there's several reasons for that. Some of which are on
the shoe to drop when the Ukraine war started, and we heard all the hyperbole about cyber attacks, and then the shoe hasn't really dropped yet, or at least we haven't heard about it.
That's right, and I think some of that is because I think there are multiple reasons for that, right? Some of that is because the Ukrainians actually turned out to be better on the defense than people were giving them credit for. They've been dealing with the Russians for 7 years,
right.
So they've had some time to practice. They're getting help from the A teams of cybersecurity companies from across the planet, which that makes a difference too. I don't think the Russians were as prepared as they probably could have been. They were also making some strategic calculations, right? If you think you're going to win this war really quick and you're going to have to own all this infrastructure, why the heck am I going to burn it down only to have to rebuild it? So I think there's a lot of reasons for that, but for the results that we've seen, but the result is that cyber has not played a strategic role. It certainly has not played a role in deciding the conflict one way or the other. And I think that's important to keep in mind, that cyber as a tool is a very useful foreign policy tool, and it can be used for a lot of things. But once you have a hot war, it may not be the most deciding factor that you've got out there. But I also think it's important not to over extrapolate from what has happened and not sort of, then say, oh, well, cyber is not going to play a role in conflict at all, because I don't think that's what the data shows either. I think it's entirely possible that if Russia, for example, decides that it is not going to win and that it has nothing to lose by being more destructive, you could see it try to go down that path.
Just like a doomsday cyber warfare launch sort of a deal.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, you decide, well, I'm never going to be able to own that infrastructure, so now I don't care about it.
They'll burn it to the ground.
Yeah. Scorched earth, digital style, right?
Yeah, digital style.
Are there implications for future conflicts, Michael? We have the China-Taiwan issue that's percolating out in the Pacific Ocean right now.
Yeah, and I think, that's going to be, so there's all sorts of interesting, ramifications. So there's a few other things here if you think about it too. So the Russia-Ukraine conflict has some interesting aspects that might not always hold, right? One is, it's about as clear an example of just unprovoked aggression that I've seen, in decades, right? There's not really a lot of question about what happened there. And so you kind of got that moral case pretty well.
Yeah, that's awesome.
Solid.
Yeah.
And then nobody's really heavily invested in the Russian economy from a Western sort of technology standpoint, right? Most Western companies you have now lost access to the Russian, to the Russian market. Were we there? It's nobody noticed, right? That they lost access to the Russian market. And so I think that, in other situations like the one that you cited, like China, Taiwan, right? For a lot of industries, that's a completely different story. And deciding to cut ties with China is a very big difference than cutting ties with Russia, right? Now, interestingly, you have a weird subcase with the cybersecurity industry, which is that the cybersecurity industry realized about 5 years ago that it was not going to get access to the Chinese market. And so most cybersecurity companies don't have this fantasy that they're going to suddenly get access to this 1.5 billion person market. Because the Chinese government made it pretty plain that they weren't going to get access unless they basically partnered with, some Chinese company that was basically going to steal all of their technology and then use it against them. So like most Western cybersecurity firms don't have a whole lot of presence in China. Unlike a lot of other sectors, they don't have a lot of partners. They don't, so that's a little bit of a wrinkle there. But I think what you see is that because of that, we're going to come all the way back around to the point that you made, Tim, at the very beginning about that digital interconnection, right? We have all these digital interconnections, and we don't even know where all these digital interconnections are. And, you get a hot war or even even a simmering conflict someplace, and we can have all sorts of weird, unexpected consequences from that we just weren't anticipating because we didn't know that X was connected to Y, which was connected to the kumquat over here, right? I mean, we just didn't see that, a priori, and but the conflict exposes it. And so I think inevitably, though, the broader principle is that conflicts in the cyber domain are going to go along with conflicts in the physical domain.
Yeah.
And inevitably that means you're going to involve the cybersecurity industry in those conflicts, whether they like it or not.
Right.
And, it's just going to be part of the landscape.
Yeah. Makes a lot of sense.
There's probably a whole nother podcast on this, but you got me thinking about a few things. What is there beyond CISA? Is there anything commercial-esque happening in the government to build out its own cybersecurity, proactive force and technology? Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, you can see the federal government doing a lot of things to, actually try to adapt to this new domain, right? And this new way of working. And yes, the federal government has moved, not moving as fast as a lot of people would like.
Mm-hmm.
But I really also think people should keep in mind that a lot of companies don't move as fast as, their employees think they should sometimes.
Sure,
right?
Sure, yeah.
And adapting to this new environment is tough. And one of the things that, when I was cybersecurity coordinator, one of the things that people would say is like, well, so who's in charge of, cyber for the government? And I would say, okay, well, what do you mean? Do you mean the federal government's own internal cybersecurity? Do you mean the federal government's interaction with the private sector to try to raise the level of cyber security across our ecosystem? Do you mean our cyber capabilities that we use to reach out and touch the bad guy? Like, those are all very different things, and they're different missions, and you're not going to be able to just sort of smush them all together.
Mm.
And so I think what you're seeing is, and this is incidentally, I think this is true. This is why organizations out in the private sector, this is why we are trying to deal with these organizational issues across the private sector. You've got all this dotted lines and cross teams and matrix positions.
Right. Yep.
It's everybody
new titles.
Yeah. It's like
title come from.
Yeah. And it's actually everybody trying to figure out, like, how do we organize ourselves in a way that's effective for the information age, for the digital age, that's different than what it was in the industrial age, right? And the government's doing the same thing. And I don't think that anybody should be surprised that it's taking us a little while to figure that out, right? What I see, Tim, is the federal government really trying to say, okay, how do we actually want to line these things up so that we can actually have the impact that we want to have on the adversary? And, there's some really interesting challenges in there for the government because, we want the government to be fair, right, in how it deals with the private sector. But yet we all know that some parts of some entities within the private sector kind of matter more than others for certain things, right? but it's kind of painful for the government to come out and say that. Yes, I'm sorry, Flo's Flower Shop, we don't care about you. I mean, it's like,
right.
Even though that's the truth, that's really painful to say, right? And yet that could change over time because, if we cared about social media in the same way that we do now, back in the early 2000s, would we still be trying to have relationships between the federal government and MySpace? That it changes.
MySpace might still exist.
It might, for all I know, and I'm sorry that if I've impugned their honor, but these things change over time, and so
right.
you've also got to have the ability to adapt and change, but yet, and the government's not good at doing that. We kind of set up the rules to say the government shouldn't really be trying to do that sort of thing, and yet we know that they have to have relationships with certain parts of the private sector that they don't have with other parts if you actually want the cybersecurity to work well.
Mm-hmm.
These are some really interesting public policy questions that it's going to take us a while to wrestle with to figure out what formula works for us. And I should note that what works for us in our political context may or may not work in anybody else's political context. And what works in their political context may not work here. So while we should also be looking at how the UK has done it and Germany or Brazil or any of those other countries, it may or may not be applicable here.
Right. And you're just unpeeling this onion of layers of complexity because we're still figuring out how to get information from the commercial to our federal government, but it's a global enterprise. So
yes.
Now from other country to other country and their commercial entity to their federal to their,
Yeah.
Wow. You just ruined my week, Michael.
That's why CTA exists. We need CTA, right? And the community that it's building between countries as well as all these different companies at the same time. Well, I think we have touched on our next 3 podcasts with Michael. As always, I love talking to Michael because I learn so much about the space. I find what CTA is doing quite intriguing, and being able to tie it back to actual real world events and activities like the Ukraine and the new incident reporting laws and so forth is always very useful for myself as well as I think our listeners. So Michael, we really appreciate your time today, and we look forward to our next conversation.
Thanks,
thank you for having me.
You got it.
Thanks a bunch. Well, for our listeners, make sure you check out other Kitecast at kiteworks.com/Kitecast.